and I want to welcome you all to tonight's panel discussion of House Bill 2, Discrimination and LGBTQ plus rights. We are fortunate to have a terrific and diverse panel tonight, and I want to take a moment to introduce our panelists to you, which will just let me orient myself for a second. So to my immediate left is Brett Ray, second year MTS student and author and trans activist. Brett is author of the book My Name is Brett, Truths from a Trans Christian, story of a transgender Christian finding his name, strength, and voice amidst a tumultuous public conversation that attempted to force a choice between queerness and Christianity. To Brett's left is India Pierce. India is program coordinator at the Center for Gender and Sexual Diversity at Duke. And from India's bio, I want to share a very affirming statement. India is a believer in the power of living an authentic life and hopes to help the students that she works with to engage in radical self-love. She is committed to creating pathways of success for queer students that affirms who they are and encourages them to use their passions to make the world we live in a better place. She has a particular interest in films made by or about queer women of color, and is also an actor herself. To the left of India Pierce is Howie Kallem. Howie is Title IX coordinator for Duke University in the Office for Institutional Equity. And here at the Divinity School, our Women's Center coordinators first got to know Howie in conversations about identifying our Women's Center as a space for women and women-identifying people, and was also a help to us as we lobbied for unisex bathrooms, or a greater number of unisex bathrooms here in the Divinity School. So we're really grateful to have Howie here as an expert on discrimination law as it applies particularly to institutions of higher education. To the left of Howie Kallem is Dr. Amy Laura Hall. She is Associate Professor of Christian Ethics here at Duke Divinity School. Dr. Hall has served on the Bioethics Task Force of the United Methodist Church. She has lectured for the Center for Bioethics and Human Dignity. She is an ordained elder in the United Methodist Church and a member of the Southwest Texas Annual Conference. One of her areas of research at present is on a particular stream of Christianity that she describes as muscular Christianity, in which particular conceptions of masculinity define understandings of what it means to be Christ-like, what it means to be a Christian leader, and so on. So she brings terrific expertise on gender and Christianity, and she is also a frequent commentator on theological and ethical dimensions of current events. To the left of Dr. Hall is Hunter Buckworth, a first-year Masters of Public Policy student at the Sanford School of Public Policy. Hunter is particularly interested in federal domestic social policy and politics, and is currently working as a non-voting board member with the North Carolina AIDS Action Network through the Sanford Board Leadership Initiative. And to Hunter's left is Professor Mac McCorkle from the School of Public Policy. And Mac has been a consultant for numerous political candidates, for state governments, for various organizations over 2 decades. Mac operates McCorkle Policy Consulting. Did. Okay, that's in the past now. Okay. And has published widely on politics and public policy, and brings to us just incredible expertise in current events, policy and politics, locally and nationally. So please offer a welcome to our fine panelists. So we are here tonight to discuss House Bill 2, more commonly known as HB2. And if you've wondered about that, some of the details of that bill, I've pulled it up here on the screen. Its short title is, where did the short title go? Public Facilities Privacy and Security Act. And you'll see it also has a longer title that gestures to its broader reach, which is to say it's not just about bathrooms. That's what folks have come to focus most publicly on, is its legislation regarding the use of multiple occupancy single-sex bathroom facilities in public places. But the longer title also signals the portion of the bill that addresses, quote, statewide consistency in regulation of employment, which has to do with discrimination in the workplace, how one may seek redress for discrimination in the workplace, which is to say, in North Carolina courts, not at all, and whether municipalities may provide additional protections from discrimination for particular groups. Answer, no longer. Okay, so if at any time in our discussion it will be helpful to look at particular portions of the bill, please let me know, and I'll be happy to scroll to that portion, whether from the panel or from in the Q&A, and you can see, the different sections of that bill. So I'm just going to say a few ground rules before we get started, and these will guide both our panelists and our audience participants. We'll have time in which the panelists speak and time for discussion and Q&A. So first ground rule is that all speech should be respectful of dissenting positions and respectful of people of all identities. We ask participants not to make assumptions about a person's gender or sexual identity and not to ask about these unless explicitly invited to do so. Participants may not speak over one another. As moderator, I will let someone know if they have spoken too long in my judgment, or I will interrupt someone whose speech is not respectful. Participants whose behavior is aggressive or violent, and this includes yelling or insulting people, will be asked to leave. So those are our ground rules. And before I hand things over to our panelists, I wanted to even just offer a quotation from a book that's been on my nightstand for the past year. So I've been reading it slowly, but it's called Queer Injustice: The Criminalization of LGBT people in the United States. And at the time that this book was published, which was in 2011, the authors were able to comment that there is generally no law requiring individuals who use bathrooms designated as for men or women to have any particular set of characteristics. But nonetheless, even at that time, the authors noted ways in which gender is often directly policed through arbitrary and violent arrests of transgender and gender nonconforming people for using, quote, the wrong restroom. They noted ways in which stereotypes about people of color, and particularly associations between people of color and violence, combined with stereotypes about transgender people, has made transgender people of color particularly vulnerable. That's something I'd like us to be aware of, particularly given that this is Martin Luther King week here at the Divinity School. And I also want to highlight that contrary to the rhetoric that has been used to support HB2 in terms of the claims that transgender people using restrooms are likely to be predators trying to get into bathrooms to harass people, that it is a fact that transgender people are more likely to experience police violence, physical violence from law enforcement by a factor of 7 times by comparison with the rest of the population. Transgender women more likely to experience sexual violence by a factor of 1.8 times by comparison with the rest of the population. There are other statistics we could look at. I just wanted to share those. And that last year, in April of 2015, a spokesperson from the Transgender Law Center, the Human Rights Campaign, and the American Civil Liberties Union indicated that no statistical evidence of violence exists to support the claims made that transgender people wish to enter bathrooms in order to harass others. NCTE, the National Center for Transgender Equality, had at that time not heard of a single instance of a transgender person harassing a non-transgender person in a public restroom. So I hope in our conversation tonight we can talk about uses of rhetoric, among other things, as they relate to stereotypes. And I also want to say that my own activism and interest in organizing this panel, and I say this with permission from my 15-year-old, is that I am the mom of a transgender teen. And so I want to say publicly how proud I am of my child for their courage. And so thank you. Okay. We now invite our panelists to each speak for about 4 minutes, and we're going to start with Mac because Mac has to leave early. And in fact, if anyone has a specific question for Mac after your initial comments, we're going to do that, and then we're going to go to the rest of the panel.
And I'll try to be brief. The reason I'm up here, I think, is because I was a political strategist. So I'm going to speak in political strategy terms. And what I wanted to say is that if this bill, if the legislature had simply gone into session and struck down the Charlotte ordinance, as a strategist, I would have had a way different strategy discussion. And it would go something like, don't despair that the fact that a beachhead was created in, of all places, a place like Charlotte, North Carolina, for this activity is power in and of itself. And there's a lot of education that needs to go on, especially among older North Carolinians, people not necessarily of bad intent, but need more understanding, and that this is a step. So don't despair simply because the legislature, especially this Republican legislator, had one of those kind of quick reactions. That would have been my advice. I don't know if that's right, but that would have been my advice. But now, that didn't happen. What happened was a massive overpowering overreach by the legislature, going after the whole notion, I think, of discrimination, disempowering any kind of legal or political action against that, in a way that made the LGBT community and assorted others, again, stigmatized as the other in legislation that I just found completely crackpot. And I have been against Republicans in Southern legislatures for a long time. I ain't seen anything like this. This amount of social engineering involved, to be honest with you, adding a level of a state discrimination statute, which had no power, was just beyond good faith, it seemed to me. So that the reaction of being totally opposed and finding this legislation be in good faith, I have to say, is completely justified. Now, let me go on even further. I've never been a friend of Pat McCrory. He's not a friend of mine. I worked against him in 2008. But the minimal act of a governor was to veto this bill. There was a short session coming up right after this. This was the craziest damn bill I have ever seen, going way beyond what they did in Georgia, going way beyond what they did in South Carolina, and both Republican governors vetoed those bills. So for Pat McCrory not to veto this bill, even for the simple fact of saying, now we're going to be a little bit more reasonable, we're actually going to have committee meetings, we're actually going to process this bill in an adult, mature way, and then maybe something will pass. Having that option and refusing that option, I think you can simply read McCrory as either in bad faith, or as I put in the papers, completely spineless. Completely spineless. Nathan Deal, when Nathan Deal was a Democrat, I actually halfway worked for Nathan Deal once in Georgia. The idea that North Carolina has a governor that is to the right of Nathan Deal is shocking to me on this. So in terms of political strategy, I think it makes it difficult because there still needs to be education among the majority, I fear, supermajority of North Carolinians who probably, if only asked the question, would be in favor of voiding the Charlotte ordinance. There are still people of goodwill who I think can come around on this issue. But the leadership behind this bill and what this bill is doing is totally unregenerate in my view, and has shown themselves to be. I see Pat McCrory now not as moderate Pat, not get along Charlotte Pat, corporate Pat, but completely appeasing to the right wing and completely acquiescing like a chameleon almost in that regard. Now, the good news, I think, is that it's also given Democrats no place to hide on this issue. And if I would have to say my consulting 10 years ago, well, again, among a lot of older Democrats and maybe rural Democrats who don't exist anymore, that this would have been a tough issue for them to understand, at least at first. But Democrats, I think, ironically, would have had more respect for the local experimentation involved. I think we could have worked with that issue. But now, I think, as you see with Roy Cooper, there's no place to hide. There has to be a pro or con, whose side are you on, pretty simple derivation. That may be the important thing, because if Roy Cooper is elected, there's a lot more momentum progressive momentum that might be created now in reaction. So while I'm depressed and pessimistic about ever trying to make sense with the Republicans, if McCrory is unseated this time, and I wouldn't have necessarily said this 6 months ago, I think you might see North Carolina actually take a quantum leap forward just simply on the momentum of this, because this bill has been so extreme, gone so far. So I'll stop there because my voice is about ready to go, and I'll hand it over to Hunter.
Are there any
Questions for Mac?
I just want to find out, so do you have an opinion about whether this is a good thing or a bad thing?
This bill? Oh, yeah. I think I made myself.
Yeah, I think you did.
Go ahead.
I don't think it's a complete blunder. As long as it stayed just that issue, the Charlotte ordinance, it probably plays well with the Charlotte base, with McCrory's base. And he needs that base because he's been seen as shaky. But sometimes issues go beyond being issues. And I think that what McCrory has stumbled on is not understanding that a lot of moderate folks, corporate folks, are just asking, what the heck is going on? I'm sure there were a lot of calls that went out going, I don't understand this legislation. They would have understand voiding it and, the Republicans won, so to the victors go the spoils, our side lost. Here, it just was such a crackpot exercise that I think it shook. People have pointed out the same-sex marriage effort did not bring out corporate support or the same-sex marriage. There was not opposition to that. Here, I think it's just gone beyond that. And that might be the opportunity because it's simply gone so far. You know, again, creating a whole new state discrimination law, but nobody can sue under it.
Right, explain,
It's
can
just-
you say more about that? Because
Yeah.
I was going to talk about that, but
Oh.
it sounds like, I mean, can you say more about that? Because I'm quoting from a ProPublica article that was co-published also with Mother Jones, and Alan Freyer, head of the Workers' Rights Project,
Yep.
said if you were fired because of your race, fired because of your gender, fired because of your religion, you no longer have a basic remedy. Can you say a little bit more about that
yeah,
before you go? Because that seems like quite smart strategy, and I could imagine why corporate North Carolina would be quite fine with that.
Well, if that was the only thing, yes and no.
Okay.
The problem is that sometimes North Carolina corporations liked litigating under the state law.
Uh-huh.
You see, there's still federal action.
Right.
And so it's all a jumble. It's one of those things that committees would have gone through and the corporate people would feel more. Now I think they're feeling totally uncomfortable. The point is that under common North Carolina law, there was an ability to sue. It was an at-will state, but if there was a very bad reason for your firing, you could sue.
As of 1985, correct?
Correct. Now, that's completely wiped out as a matter of statutory law. You still can go into federal court under the federal system. So again, it's more that it reflects bad will and bad intent by the creators of the legislation. The exact effect is it might be a little unclear. Corporations might not want everybody going into federal court doing, so that's a little unclear, but the intent is clear.
Hi, I'm Andrew Patty. I'm a Divinity student. What I was wondering, I think about the timeline of how these things are going. And so Georgia, the governor rejected. Here it got passed. But recently Mississippi has come up. And I was wondering, once these ordinances start getting acceptance from, North Carolina and Mississippi being the first two, how do you think this will affect the political dialogue across the country? Do you think it'll be a southeastern issue, or do you think this really has a base to go further than that?
My sense of it is it's probably a southern-based issue. Indiana has already experienced roughly this and maybe has learned its lesson a little bit. And so I think you may see this crop up in Alabama. Alabama has other issues right now with its governor that's got to deal with. So you might see it cropping up in the South. But Nathan Deal in Georgia, by vetoing it, probably sent a message to a lot of Republican governors. And I would think a lot of them are going, what is McCrory doing? This was the time, again, I'll just say this, whatever McCrory thought about the Charlotte issue, the Charlotte ordinance, he still should have vetoed it. And everybody knows it, including McCrory, and made people go reason and walk through it in a special session where you could have done what Laura's question, that could have been explained. Now no one really knows what the bill will ultimately entail.
So I'm not nearly as knowledgeable as Mac is. That's why I'm taking classes from him at the moment. But I can, I suppose, speak to my experience as a student and my reaction personally to. I'll start off with an anecdote. Just this past weekend, Sanford had their admitted students weekend event, open house. So all of the students who were admitted to the school came, and the ones who could make it came and met all of us, current students, administrators, teachers, kind of got a feel for what it would be like if they came to Duke. And from one particular admitted student, she expressed concern that North Carolina, Durham, Duke, Sanford were going to be unwelcoming places for her to be because of this particular law. So it's, and I believe she's from California. So like this is a national embarrassment, and it's reflecting poorly on Duke and on Sanford just residually from having, from being located here. And I spent a good 15 minutes trying to explain to her that, it's not representative of my views. It's not representative of the people that I know at Sanford or at Duke or in Durham or even outside of it. I know there are plenty of people who are in favor of it. Luckily, I don't have many of them in my life. But yeah, that was a sad conversation to have. In terms of my initial reaction, I suppose I am privileged in the sense that I don't have to worry about its direct effects. And so it's easy for me to say this is, I can't really take this that seriously. It's going to get overturned as it goes through the appeals process. Supreme Court in 1996 ruled that a Colorado statute that banned non-discrimination ordinances, local non-discrimination ordinances against the LGBT community, or even it might have been the gay community back then, that was unconstitutional under equal protection. And then in the same vein that people say that Clinton was the first black president, I think Anthony Kennedy is the first gay justice. He wrote Romer, Lawrence, which overturned sodomy bans. He wrote Windsor, which struck down Prop 8, and he wrote Obergefell, which legalized same-sex marriage across the country. And so as long as he's on the court, and he still is, especially considering Scalia's passing, I think that the courts, if it makes it all the way to the Supreme Court, it looks pretty favorable. Law gets overturned. And then just humorously, I kind of muse, like, how are they planning on enforcing this? They're, going to have people, maybe there was an op-ed, I forget which paper, it might have been the News and Observer, that it was going to be a job-creating bill, and they should spin it that way, so that they would have people that whose sole job would be to stand outside the bathroom and check people's birth certificates. Lost my train of thought.
We can come back to you.
Yeah, it'll come up immediately after you stop talking. Or start talking.
Yeah.
Well, I can say that I think one of our reactions for some of us on faculty was to try to, after lament, anger, etc., was to figure out ways to do something humorous. I think we considered the possibility of a P-in, where we would try to go into bathroom. So
I did.
go.
Oh, okay.
Go.
And I'm gonna lose it now that I just thought about it again. That's okay. Good. This is I'm still questioning why they let me be on this panel. The law really is replacing a fictional threat in that most of the people that I've talked to are familiar with this bill as a bill that prevents sexual predators from preying on women and girls in their bathrooms. That some of them might not even think that really the disproportionate impact is on the transgender and LGBT community at large. And so just in the sense that it's really hard to enforce and probably toothless in that sense, it serves a big purpose as a tool for harassment, bullying, and stigma in the LGBT community. And that, I think, is the more serious, the primary reason why, this law has become, national embarrassment, and why a lot of businesses are pulling out of the state. I think, as Mac was saying, I think there is an opportunity to use this as kind of a shock to the system and really try and get some awareness and advocacy surrounding LGBT issues. So now is your time. Go use this opportunity to keep stirring up dissent and making sure that everyone knows that this is not North Carolina, it's not Duke, it's not Sanford. We are not this.
I know why you're on the panel. Thank you. So the article that I quoted before that I think would be really helpful for later after we've had this panel discussion, so I'm not recommending you look it up right this minute, but you might glance at it. It was published April 5th and then updated on April 6th. And the title of it is very provocative. This is the way people get things published. Why North Carolina's new anti-LGBT law is a Trojan horse. It's not just bathrooms. Lawmakers also took away the right to sue under state law for all kinds of employment discrimination. It's by a woman named Nina Martin, and it was published in ProPublica and also co-published with Mother Jones. And it has links and specifics about what many people who work in civil rights law, who work in labor law in North Carolina are very concerned about in terms of the wide-reaching implications of what I would call deeply cynical opportunism on the part of the legislature. I guess I wouldn't call it crackpot because I think it was very well strategized. And I don't think that we're in disagreement, that Mac and I would be in disagreement on that. But from my perspective, when I think about what this, the whole language of security, these such things that were in the rhetoric of this bill and the promotion of this bill and the reporting of it all over the mainstream media, you have within a significant part of at least a Christian population and probably non-Christian as well, within people's kind of gut and sometimes at the forefront of their brain, but often in their gut, that this sense that what holds all of civilization together is a gender and sex binary, and that any life, any existence outside of that gender and sex binary will result in anarchy and chaos. So you have I think politicians and funders who are funding them to say things. You have them manipulating the rhetoric so that people find themselves thinking this is a bill about security. This is a bill about holding all of civilization together by reinforcing that binary. And so once you have that in mind, it seems like a very strategically smart way to undermine labor rights for many, many people. And it also, I think, is is it civil discourse for me to call this evil? Because I think it is evil. I think it is an evil opportunism because it takes particular human beings who walk around in this world dignified as children of God and names them as a site, as a source of anarchy, chaos, and disruption, and then uses that language as a wedge to bring about further discrimination and worker insecurity during the Second Great Depression. So I find it evil on multiple levels and really smart.
So what impressed me about this is that they started, and I'm building somewhat on what Max said, they started with the bathroom issue and they said, okay, let's take care of this. Oh, and while we're at it, what other damage could we do? And so one other area where they threw in restriction, and now, what's out there that's, bothers us on the right? Well, those living wage bills, all these crazy cities that are trying to, raise the minimum wage to $15 an hour. Why don't we take care of that? Yeah, well, let's throw that in too. No study on this, no discussion. So now cities can't have local ordinances that would apply to private employers and set any thing related to working conditions, including minimum wage, hours of work, that sort of thing. If a city has a contract with a company to build a building for the city can't require as a condition of that contract anything regarding the employment conditions or wages of the contractor's employees. Okay, so we've got that taken care of. So what else could we throw in? Yeah, right. Let's say that local governments and colleges and universities can't have laws in place that are broader than what we're saying they can prohibit, discrimination laws. So it's going to be restricted to race, religion, color, national origin, age, biological sex, and disability. And yes, so we're having this uniform statewide standard, but as was said, you can't go to court in the state for this. But it leaves out, so many local governments around the country when they have their non-discrimination policies. Well, they have sexual orientation, which I think was intentionally excluded from this. But so many of them, they include parental status, marital status, veterans, political orientation. So now Durham and Charlotte and Raleigh, and Chapel Hill can't have local laws prohibiting discrimination in employment on any of those bases. And it's not just in employment, it's also in what are called places of public accommodation. These are places that are private but are open to the public. So that would include movie theaters, hotels, restaurants, and all that. Local governments cannot have laws that tell these places you can't discriminate on anything more than race, religion, color, national origin, and biological sex. And so the city of Durham can't tell a particular restaurant that they're prohibited from refusing to serve a parent who comes in with a young child. They can now, it wouldn't be unlawful for them, for that restaurant to exclude that parent. So they really went beyond all the, and it's in the same thing, even if you're discriminated or you believe you were discriminated against based on race, religion, color, national origin, biological sex by one of these places of public accommodations, then, and that would include Duke as well, is a place of public accommodation, although the law doesn't prohibit us from having broader policies, and we do. There's no private right of action in court for the protections that the statute does provide. So it was obviously rushed through, but in a very calculated way, to jump on what they perceive to be a popular issue, the bathrooms, but then to, I believe, throw in all these other issues that can have a really far-ranging effect on the folks in the state, and we'll see how that all develops.
Hey, I think that, this topic and talking about House Bill 2 is a little overwhelming for me. And I think I sit situated intersectionally with a couple of different identities that makes it hard for me to show up, right? And for me to feel as if I am able to be kind of fully affirmed in the spaces that I go to. So as was mentioned earlier, so I work on campus primarily doing work related to sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression at the Center for Sexual and Gender Diversity. So I think I am knee deep in these issues all the time. And part of our kind of main task in the work that we do is to create an inclusive campus climate, right, for people with marginalized SOGI. So SOGI being sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expression here on campus. And so part of that work is for us to work with people like Howie and other folks on campus who are creating policies to make sure that those policies and the accommodations that we have on campus meets the needs of our students, staff, and faculty. And I think that while we're very lucky at Duke to have some progressive policies that provide protections to queer and trans folks, as a community activist and an organizer, I know that for many queer people, for many trans people, for many people of color, they are constantly facing discrimination and struggling to make ends meet. And so the passage of House Bill 2 is an attempt to further kind of criminalize trans and queer people. And the legislation, for me, undoubtedly means that there's a new reality for these communities. There's a new reality here on Duke's campus, although the House bill states that private companies can have their own discrimination clauses. It's still a new reality on this campus, especially as we are encouraging our students to have civic engagement beyond Duke, right? And so as a staff member, as a member of the Durham community, I have to think about how life changes beyond kind of the spaces of Duke's campus for me and for my students. And so what becomes very obvious for me is that, you know, House Bill 2 both is contrary to my personal values and beliefs, but also contrary to the mission of my center and the work that we do. And so as I was thinking a lot about this, I was, one, kind of reflecting on the fact that there are so many things kind of tied up in this House bill beyond people's right to use the bathroom. And so I as I'm talking to folks, attempt to allow, to push them to see how this impacts their lives too. I think that often it's easy for us to write off things that we don't see as being directly correlated for us. If we don't identify as trans, if we don't identify as gender nonconforming, then it's easy for us to be apathetic as it relates to this bill. But as someone who identifies as queer and not trans and not gender nonconforming, my liberation and my freedom is undoubtedly tied and bound to the liberation and freedom of gender nonconforming people and trans people, right? For me, freedom does not come parsed apart in that way, just as it is not, I can't have the black side of myself get free and the queer side of myself is not. And so I think that, you know, as I look at this, I'm thinking about how do we have a conversation about how we support one another and we love one another and we make sure that we are all kind of moving in a space in which we can show up authentically ourselves and what that looks like, because just as Black lives matter, queer lives matter, and trans lives matter, and gender nonconforming lives matter.
As Dr. Portier-Young said, my name is Brett, and among many, many other things, I identify as queer and as a transmasculine person, which means that I use masculine pronouns and gender-neutral pronouns. Throughout my time here at Duke, I've worked closely with members of the Sacred Worth community to help make safer space in Duke for queer students, faculty, staff, and our loved ones who walk through these doors. So I'm really committed to this kind of difficult conversation, and I'm appreciative that I get to be a part of it and that y'all are a part of it as well. I think most simply, I wanted to be on this panel because I have many loved ones, and I am someone who multiple times a day uses a bathroom that doesn't align to the sex that's on my birth certificate. And it's terrifying to me that there could be legal repercussions for something so mundane as to me having to go to the bathroom. I'm here because myself and my queer loved ones can be discriminated against simply because we're queer in jobs and in housing, and I see HB2 as an unwarranted, fear-based attack that attacks queer people and disproportionately affects non-binary and trans women of color. I think that HB2 and its proponents treat the people that HB2 harms like they're issues. And I want to say right now from the beginning that I am not an issue, and our queer loved ones are not issues. We are people worthy of respect and love and value, just like every other person in this room. And so my role on this panel is not to speak for every trans person or for every queer person, but my role on this panel is to remind everyone as we move through this conversation that HB2 is not just a bill and it's not just a law, but it's my life and it's my queer loved ones' lives and it's your lives. So I'm here as a Christian, as a transmasculine person, as a colleague, and as a friend to say we are not this.
So before we open up to Q&A with the audience participants, we have a pair of questions to ask our panelists, and we invite the panelists to just respond as you feel you wish to respond. If a question doesn't really stir any great insight in you, answer the next one. But our first question is, what do you feel? We've the comments that we've heard so far have already touched on this a fair bit. But what do you feel are the emotional ramifications, spiritual ramifications, political ramifications of HB2 for our state, our churches, and the Duke community? And again, some of the comments, particularly India's and Brett's comments, began to speak directly to that question. And so we'll just pause and ask if anyone on the panel would like to add anything about that question in terms of emotional, spiritual, political ramifications.
I guess I just want to second what Brett said about the House Bill 2 kind of rendering people invisible and making them issues, and the fact that we really have to start to examine and think about, what happens to our spirits when pieces of our humanity are being put up for public debate. And so as we start to think about what are the things that allies, and so I try not to use that word, but just for ease, because everyone kind of understands what that means, for folks who stand in solidarity with queer and trans and gender nonconforming people, I think that is where support starts, right? And acknowledging that someone's life and the elements that make them who they are being debated, right? That it is public discourse, and how privacy is no longer it becomes a luxury. And so what can we all in this room do to provide kind of emotional support for those people?
Anyone else on this question?
I would add perhaps that one of the things that has struck me in walking around since the bill was passed and just listening to people in public places. I was in Carborough at Carborough's like hipster central, right? I mean, it's like Carborough, and all of these women, and I won't name which shop, but all of these women were sitting around discussing this bill and debating it, arguing with one another about it in terms of safety, using this language, and I almost, like, interjected and then decided, no, I'm not going to walk up and start interrupting these women I don't know at all. Because they seem to all know one another. But it just struck me. I was like, this is such a brilliant way to divide and conquer people, so that we're talking about this. I mean, there are people who have in solidarity fought for the right to go to the bathroom while you're in the workplace at all, and continue to have to do that. I mean, there are people in factories in North Carolina who don't have stipulation to even use the restroom, and we should be talking about that, but we're not. Instead, we're doing this thing of naming certain human beings who walk around in the world as children of God as being sources of anarchy, chaos, and danger. And it's just astounding to me. And as one of the things that I've heard several people say, that I don't want to ever use what happened at Penn State lightly. So I don't use this lightly. I mean, what happened at Penn State was horrific, and it did not involve like somebody outside the walking around in the world as a sex binary person. I mean, it was a systemic evil, and instead we're talking about individual human beings with dignity as children of God, as if they're sources of anarchy. And it just seems like a brilliant way to divide North Carolinians and distract us from the many issues we ought to be working on economically to protect the dignity of each of us in our own workplace and in other workplaces across the country.
Just to add to that, I would say that it's even a little bit worse than that, in the sense that when you say they're naming these, communities and singling them out and talking about queer people and trans threats to safety, they're not even talking about queer people and trans people. They're so dehumanized that they framed it in some other way that, like Brett said, turned trans and queer people into issues. And the fact that the General Assembly thought that this criminalization of our identities and our bodies merited, rushing in and having a special session in a matter of hours, not giving anybody the chance to actually read what was in the bill or oppose it in debate is, I'm speechless. The priorities just don't make sense. And the fact that they think this is a priority makes it seem like the queer and trans community further victimized and doesn't have a safe place in the state.
So the second question is a practical one. What are next steps for Duke and individuals at Duke? What are next steps for individual people of faith and faith communities? What are next steps for activists and community organizers?
Depends. I mean, I would say people who have legal ability to do work in the legal realm should be doing that. People who are creative and make puppets should be doing street theater in front of the chapel. People who have the capacity to write rhetorically well for folks who are scared and are vulnerable to this fear-mongering should be using their rhetorical skills to preach love and not hate in a really simple way, and to preach hope and not fear. So I think there are multiple different ways depending on people's gifts. And I will say one of the things that, I can't remember who named this first, but early on under this legislature, somebody named the strategy that what they're doing is shock and awe, that what they're doing is trying to have us be so in shock by the, the gall of their methods that we're sort of rendered speechless. And so I would say continuing to figure out how to find creative ways to tap into your own individual particular gifts, and find others with gifts like yourselves, to act out and change, and not be silent, and try not to, for all of us, try not to get so angry and scared that we just are speechless.
I was going to say, I think something very practical too that we can all do is to stop assuming the binary. Even just when you introduce yourself to someone, say what pronouns you prefer or what pronouns you use and are right for you, and ask what pronouns are right for them too. Because I can say that it's already, in many spaces when I would prefer gender-neutral pronouns, it already shuts a lot of doors when people automatically use masculine pronouns for me just based on what I look like. And so I think asking those sorts of questions and not assuming things about people's family life, like when we're asking about people's family or what they're doing, don't say if you're looking at a woman, how's your husband, or what does your husband do, or something like that. So there are all of these little ways just in language that we can sort of open up a lot of space for people to feel more comfortable and to feel like they can exist more easily as themselves with you.
I guess I definitely agree with the point that this is not a time for silence. I think that there are some wonderful organizations that are being loud and making it known that, this is not who we are, and we won't stand for this, and we don't want this House bill. And so for those of us who are activist-minded, I would encourage you all to get involved in those organizations in Durham, because I think that a lot of movement is happening in those fronts. And so that is a place where we can definitely make a difference. I know that there are several petitions going around the state. And so if you are more of a passive activist, that is a way to get involved. I will also say that, this is a time for education. A lot of fear comes out of the unknown. And so if there are issues that you don't understand about the trans community, about what it means to show up in the world as gender nonconforming or queer, I think this is an opportunity for you all to kind of participate and to intentionally go into those spaces to expand your horizons. I will also say that this is a time in which we are called to examine our own privilege. And to really think about how we show up in spaces and how that might not necessarily be the ways in which other people can show up in spaces. And so microaggressions are little things that become, there are these little annoying things that we often do and that we don't realize that we're doing, right? And it's often based out of our own positions of privilege. And so I encourage us all to think about how we can love more. And in doing that, I think it really calls for us to look at our own places of privilege and how we may oversee some other people because of that.
Also look to Duke. There are some organizations now that are not going to hold conferences in the state, that already have canceled them. Can't move Duke, although we've talked about it in our office where we'd like to go. But when the law was passed, Duke issued a statement, and it's good that they did, that said that the law doesn't apply to us because we're private. Okay. But as far as I know, we haven't signed that letter that went to the governor,
Right.
that takes a position against the law. I think that, UNC Chapel Hill would be much more difficult for them to do that because they're a state institution, but I know there are conversations there about possibly doing that. I think that we want to consider, and when we can make the case, it builds on what Hunter said. You know, we're trying to attract students to come here. We're trying to attract employees to come here. Having a message that the message that this bill sends out, that the state value diversity, can be very chilling to recruiting the best people to come here. And so I think we have an institutional interest in speaking out against this, and to consider what can be done to convince the institution to more publicly oppose it. I was very careful. I used to work for the federal government, and if I said anything like that against the federal agency I worked with, I would have been in a lot of trouble.
No,
So
but
this is-
that's, I think that makes total sense. That makes yes.
Hunter, anything you want to add on this question?
I just wanted to echo pretty much everything that has been said already, and reiterate. This is a terrible bill, but a good opportunity for those of us who care about these issues to go out in the community and use the prominence of the issue to continue.
All right, so at this time, we're going to open up to audience questions for our panelists, as well as audience comments. If something has just welled up and you would just like to speak out, we invite you to do so, again, following the ground rules that were laid out at the beginning. Heidi has a microphone. We have another mic if it becomes awkward and we need one on each side of the room. So we'll take questions from the audience.
I have a question that's particularly directed to Howie, given your position with Title IX. How do you see HB2 in relationship to Title IX? Is it in violation of Title IX? And what happens next if it is?
So before I came to Duke, I worked for the Office for Civil Rights at the U.S. Department of Education, which is the federal agency that enforces Title IX, which is the federal law that prohibits sex discrimination. I also, before that, worked at the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, which is a federal law that prohibits discrimination, including sex discrimination, in employment. And this bill touches on both employment and education. And there has been a lot of talk about possibly state as a whole and the state institution. Lots of figures of as much as $4.5 billion or perhaps more. Federal funds. It's not that easy. It's not that clear. Regarding sexual orientation and the prohibition bill that for local governments to have policies that prohibit discrimination based on sexual orientation, until very recently, almost all the federal courts in the country said that both Title VII regarding employment and Title IX regarding education, that the prohibition there against sex discrimination did not include sexual orientation. That's why there have been attempts over the years to pass additional legislation, others that would specifically expand the protections of federal laws to sexual orientation. So, but just recently, the federal government, the EEOC and OCR and the Department of Justice have come out with some positions and decisions that now take the position that Title IX's prohibition against sex discrimination is broad enough to include sexual discrimination based on sexual orientation. I think there's one federal district court case that has agreed with that, but that's just one. So it remains to be seen if that position will get endorsed by other court cases. And so it's not clear yet whether what the bill has to say about sexual orientation or excluding sexual orientation will be considered by courts as discrimination based on sex in violation of Title IX, such as Title IX funds can be yanked. OCR can take unilateral action regarding this if they want to. That's a matter of the political will of this administration months before a presidential election. But I know that from the folks that I work with at OCR that they are talking about this. It's a big issue, and they are talking about possible ways to address this. Regarding the trans issue, the bathroom issue, that's a little clearer. The federal agencies and more courts a number of courts have said that Title IX and Title VII's prohibition against sex discrimination does include prohibition against discrimination based on gender identity. And so there's more of a precedent out there. But the wrinkle there is, and you may have heard that there's a case in Virginia now involving a school district where a student was not allowed to use the bathrooms and shower facilities, locker room facilities of the gender to which they identified. And despite the efforts of OCR and this lawsuit that the federal court had said that the school didn't have to allow them to do that it was enough for the school to allow them to use a single-use facility, which parenthetically was extremely difficult for this child because it was not centrally located. It was child to get there, and locked because it was a teacher bathroom. Mm-hmm. So the kid had to go find somebody to get the key, then which was in another part of the building, and then go to the bathroom, and they're missing class and all that, and it was even more difficult regarding the locker room facilities for PE. But anyway, so this case is on appeal to the Fourth Circuit, and which is the Federal Court of Appeals, which covers all of the state and other states in this part of the country. So, and it's possible that the Court of Appeals will uphold the district court and say the law doesn't cover trans individuals. It's possible that the law will say that it does cover, that the court will say it does cover trans individuals, but that all the school has to do is provide that single-use facility as a way to accommodate the individuals. And it's also possible that the Court of Appeals will reverse the district court and say that they have to allow the child to use the facility identify with. It's all up in the air, and the federal government tends to be, even in more progressive administrations, tends to be kind of slow and bureaucratic and careful about what it does. So while, again, I know that there are discussions about this, it's at the federal level, the law perhaps is not as clear and as settled so that the federal government will be ready to take a bold stance on this and prohibition, and if you don't change it, we're going to take away federal funds from school districts and colleges. So that's why there's a private lawsuit now challenging in the law, because waiting for the federal government, while it might act, it shouldn't be the only efforts.
So this is a little bit of a strategy question, which unfortunately he had to leave. But the bill very clearly targets trans folk. But as you all have mentioned, there are also a lot of other parts of this bill that are problematic and target groups of people, especially in talking with people from out of state or people who don't necessarily know much about the bill. Do you have any advice? I mean, there are so many parts of the bill that I have problems with that it's almost overwhelming to talk about it. Do you have any advice in terms of discussing how it's harmful to people who identify as transgender without leaving out all the other problematic, like all the other kind of issues Sorry, that was a little convoluted.
I think it's an opportunity to build coalitions, with other groups that the bathroom issue might not be their priority. As I said, it prohibits local governments from having living wage bills. Well, there's a whole national effort around that now, and there are organizations that are, dedicated to that. There's an opportunity there to work together with that group. The bill doesn't mention disability. That's huge. And the state claims that there are other state laws that protect against disability discrimination. But the jury's still out on that. So that's another area or group that we could build people could build coalitions with on trying to make it clear that this is really a calculated attack on a variety of folks. That doesn't answer your question about individual discussions, I don't think, but it might. But it does offer some possible political pressure.
Going to your the part of your question about just how do you talk to people about this, I think most people have no idea what this law is, and the base level informed people know or refer to it as the transgender bathroom bill. And so I would start by just informing them, of what this bill actually is and what it actually does, and trying to formulate a succinct, understandable way of conveying all of this complicated legalese. And I think a good way to do that is to use personal stories and how they impact individuals. If you try to convey a message and you use, a person that someone can identify with, and how they are affected, then people are more likely to both understand the concepts and be willing to act to make it better.
PolitiFact North Carolina put out sort of a Mythbusters kind of a statement that goes through a variety of the provisions of the bill, and I think that could be helpful in parsing the bill and how it applies and helping you to figure out how to explain what it covers.
I do have a quick question of myself. I've noticed this really disturbing thing, especially evil things like this bill, and I think it's evil, of doing evil things in the name of protecting women and children. I also think of this summer when Dylan Roof shoot up Mother Emanuel. He said, these people are raping our women. So we're seeing this alarming kind of thing of just this evil in the name of protecting women and children. And I was just wondering if any of you guys could speak to that, because it's just very disconcerting to me.
Yeah, I guess I just say yes. That's exactly, and it's so absurd. The fact that those women in Carver were not discussing Spotlight, the movie, and talking about the way that the Vatican covered up. There are so many ways to talk about protecting vulnerable people that we're not talking about, and instead it happens this way. It's just stunning to me. But I will say I found that in actual one-on-one conversations with people, you can have conversations about the facts of the matter. You can also, like you said, talk about people's lived experience. One man, and I don't think he'd mind, I won't say his name or anything, but one man at church who definitely is not politically at the same place that I am. I know because he reads my column and will often argue with me about him. But he said, it's funny. I don't understand the big deal. He was the primary caregiver for his daughter, and he said, when we were someplace, she'd go in the bathroom with me. That's the way we did it. And he said it was really convenient if there was a family bathroom. That was nice.
But he said, I don't get the big deal. Like, you know, you go in the bathroom, you go to the bathroom and you come out. And he was, and it was like, he just had a kind of, you know, basic, like, sense that it was, what was the big deal? Did we need a law somehow to make sure that his daughter didn't go in the bathroom with him? And it was just those kinds of conversations can break things open. I do want to say one other thing that's kind of connected to both your questions, and that is that I've watched strategists around Amendment 1 really fail in that we were being told, and I even did this when a strategist told me, like, we need you on WRAL to talk about this, this, and this. And I was like, but that's not, I want to talk about LGBTQ people and dignity, and no, you need to talk about this, this, and this, like the other ramifications of Amendment 1, instead of making a clear pro-LGBTQ message. You had people, the strategists were telling us just to say a different thing, and I didn't end up saying anything I didn't believe, but at the same time, I was being told, like, not to say clearly this is an amendment against LGBTQ people and it is wrong. And so I want to be careful as we're talking about this, that we don't do what the person at the back was asking, like, how do we make sure we don't fail to name that this is clearly a scapegoating, fear-mongering bill that names human beings as a danger, that people who aren't a danger as a danger and as a menace to civilization.
I think one thing I would add to, just in talking about women and children, is, you know, is how that is rooted in cissexism, right? And so we're only concerned about cisgender women, cisgender little girls. And then when we think about trans women, especially trans women of color, and the amount of discrimination and violence that they face if they are not killed, then those are the groups of people that we should also be looking at as protected classes. And how are we providing safe accommodations for them if we are telling them that they have to go into the men's restroom? And I think that that's important, because we're talking about that and protecting kind of one class of women. We're protecting of privileged women who are cisgendered, and, you know, trans women are definitely kind of the most vulnerable group of people.
Follow up on what you said, as well as what you said. This goes back to, you know, people are uncomfortable with anything outside of the binary, and the binary is all they understand. And so they found, the architects of this bill found a way to criminalize femininity, and those who fall outside the binary, like, you know, men understand cisgender women as wives and children, so they can be protected. We can protect them. But, you know, female to male transgender individuals aren't male enough, and male to female transgender individuals are moving away from maleness, so that's bad too. And I can't even get into, you know, the people that don't identify within this binary, because I can't understand that. I think a lot of it comes from, you know, a lack of understanding about LGBT issues, and then the areas where people are familiar, and they're able to, you know, they want to protect the women and children, but really they want to protect kind of their notion of masculinity and what society at large should be like.
Just a comment and a quick question. I just wanted to point out the panelists have pretty consistently been using they as a singular gender-neutral pronoun. And for the Divinity folks in the room, I want to suggest that could maybe be a good way to talk about God, and it would solve a lot of problems with how we talk about God and use pronouns. Question, building off of Dr. Portia Young's last question, do you know of any specific upcoming direct actions or protests in the area in which we can participate?
That. So, your student, maybe?
I don't know so I don't know the dates of any at the moment. So I'm really involved with Song. Song is Southerners on New Ground. And so I would encourage you all to look into Song's organization that kind of advocates on behalf of people of color, of immigrants, of queer people, of trans people, of people with a variety of marginalized identities. And so most of the news footages that you all have been seeing on the news where they were outside, where folks were outside of the governor's mansion, and you were seeing folks chained sitting on the ground, those were Song people. And so I feel really proud to be a part of that organization. And so Song, North Carolina has a Facebook page. I think that's a really good place to start. Because one of the things I really love about the organizing that's happening right now is that people are coming together. So it's not just Song, it is workers organizations, it is youth organizations, because everyone sees the invested interest in this. So that's kind of where I would start and see kind of what's happening from there, because I know there's just something in Greensboro, and so I imagine there's going to be something in
I'm sort of building off of Amy Laura Hall's comment. Grew up single parent home mother with a single bathroom, 5 children. So there's brothers and sisters. So it was not all that exciting to use the bathroom together. But one of the things I can say about the bathroom experience, though, we're often focusing on sort of gender binary. And I wonder if a big part of the conflict is sort of, you might call it like a sexual gaze, how certain bodies become over-sexualized within our culture. And I'm particularly thinking of African-American trans women because they're the most prone to be forced into sex work, and how our societal sort of, how as a society we place people in over-sexualized contexts. I don't know. I'm just sort of thinking about that and fleshing that out and wondering if you have any ideas around how we think about that.
I would just agree that I mean, one of my favorite about LGBTQ rights is it's an old-fashioned 1950s poster kind of thing where the heteronormative couple are peeking out their window, and she's saying to her husband, "Look, the lesbians are doing their laundry." It's like, I mean, certain lives become marked as sexually charged. Yeah, I've heard in 17 years of teaching here, I've heard story after story after story of people recounting what it was like to be a teenager and trying to figure out how to come out to their churches, to their families, and a big part of it was fear that they were going to be clearly ostracized for being sexual at all.
I think as a society, we understand ourselves by recognizing the difference that we see in other people. And so trans women are definitely othered and seen as something to be studied, to be conquered, to be explored, and in many ways are exoticized in that. And so we think about like the porn industry and the ways in which trans women are overly sexualized in those spaces as well. And so it kind of, I think it directly kind of ties into our notions about women's bodies and those bodies belong to, and I think that when it comes to trans women, and especially to trans women of color, I think there's so many layers to that as it relates to kind of the history of oppression, and this history of kind of rendering things queer, right? Because I think Black women's bodies were rendered queer at a moment, and rendered and weren't seen as their own. And so I definitely think that that is something that we can be argued as being the same for trans women, especially trans women of color.
For a long time, it's been said that ignorance is bliss, but we know the truth is that ignorance is dangerous, and ignorance votes, and ignorance runs for office, and ignorance prevails in lots of ways. And so with that in mind, from someone who is about to become a pastor and receive an appointment, I would like your opinions on some really sound resources that will help educate people about the truth. I think there's tremendous misunderstanding about the word queer in particular. And based on having gone on a little mission to ask different people what it means, I will attest to the fact that there is a lot of misinformation out there. So I would be interested in based on your expertise, what are some good resources for lay people that we can have at our fingertips to say, here's a good place to go find the truth?
So I think there are lots of resources. I unfortunately didn't bring anything with me, but if people want to email me, so we have a list of resources, both national and local organizations, websites that folks can check out, as well as we have a library full of books on a variety of topics that any member of the Duke community is welcome to rent and to rent out of our library and to use at their own as it is convenient for them. So I would say like kind of that is a really good place to start. And then, yeah. Well, that's us. Technology is amazing.
You're talking, she's got them all.
Yes, I would definitely say to start there, and then depending on what your interests are, I can give you some specific things. I mean, language, you talked about queer. Language is ever evolving, and I think that there are folks who are constantly feeling like the language that already exists in the world doesn't fit them, and it doesn't allow them to show up authentically. And so there are always new terms popping up. So I am constantly telling people that mastery is not a necessity, and we just updated our definition list. I think now our definition list is at 5 pages, and there were lots of words that I had no idea exist, and so that's not necessarily important. I think what is important about the usage of the word queer is that queer has a negative history towards it, and so when I am talking to people about language, and I'm telling people that they should mirror the language that people use. So I wouldn't call someone queer unless they told me that they identify as queer, because queer has such a loaded history with it, and there are people who still hear the word queer and they hear that negativity, just like the word fag, right? And so we wouldn't use that word, and so I think queer should be kind of approached with caution in the same way. I think there are also many ways in which queer is becoming an umbrella term, and I mean that is both convenient and problematic. And so I I just wouldn't use it. I identify as queer. I have no problem with using the word queer. I feel like I have a good understanding of what it means for me. But I would not encourage people to use the word queer unless they're mirroring the, like if you were talking about me and you said, oh, she's queer, then that's fine. But if I never told you I was queer and you're just calling me queer, then I think that is kind of the space in which I wouldn't use it.
I would say too, particularly helpful for people of faith would be the Reconciling Ministries Network or Believe Out Loud.
Definitely.
Yeah, especially I have more connections with the Reconciling Ministries Network and than I do Believe Out Loud, but the Reconciling Ministries Network has people in all of the regions of the country, and they're very good at responding to emails, and so there's more of a sort of face-to-face that can happen there than just looking at a flyer on the internet, though they have those there as well.
And I have a wonderful friend who lives in Durham who is a trans man, who is a Black trans man and is also a minister. And so he's doing wonderful work in Durham and in Chapel Hill talking about trans issues and how to kind of address trans issues from the perspective of the clergy members. And so if you would be interested in having a conversation with him, then I could definitely introduce you.
And one other thing about the Believe Out Loud website too is they have, I don't know exactly where it is, but they have a spot on the website where you can find churches who have identified themselves as LGBTQ plus friendly for many of the mainline Protestant denominations. So if that's a thing that you're looking for, they can kind of point you in the right direction throughout the country.
Right, we're going to take this opportunity to thank our panelists. And I want to offer also a special word of thanks to the many co-sponsors for this event. At the Divinity School, the co-sponsors include Sacred Worth, our student LGBTQ plus advocacy group, the Women's Center, the Program for Gender, Sexuality, Theology, and Ministry, and Office of Black Church Studies, thank you. And beyond the Divinity School, our sponsors include the Office for Institutional Equity, the Duke Center for Sexual and Gender Diversity, and Sanford School of Public Policy, as well as the Women's Center, or the Women's Studies Department and the Women's Center. So this event had a lot of support behind it and the hard work of a number of our students, including Laura Musser, Heidi Johnson, Joy Wanafried, and others. And so I just want to thank all of them as well. And thanks to all of you who came tonight during what I know is a incredibly busy time of the semester. And I want to encourage all of you to continue the conversations, continue breaking silences, and continue discerning how you as individuals, how we as a Duke community, and how we in our separate faith communities, community organizations, and so on can continue to advocate for equal rights and full inclusion for all people. Thank you.
While I have all of your attention, one way that you guys can support local LGBTQ nonprofits and HIV/AIDS advocacy nonprofits and have fun in the process, there's a evening of gender-swapped show tunes on Monday in Chapel Hill called Broadway Twisted, and the donations benefit Broadway Cares, Equity Fights AIDS, as well as my nonprofit, the North Carolina AIDS Action Network. So if you find yourself down there and you want to listen to some gender swap show tunes, it's there.
Right. And I'll also say the Sacred Worth Facebook page, if folks aren't members of that page, as well as the Divinity Women's Center Facebook page, are great places to share events that you are aware of, and post links to to collaborative efforts that you'd like to encourage people to be a part of. So do our coordinators for either of those groups want to add anything about that? Okay. All right. Thank you again.